Emily is Senior Vice President of Programs on the national level for AARP Foundation, and she will be our keynote speaker. We feel very fortunate to have her speaking here in Utah for us. Emily's career spans various sectors and locations, demonstrating a commitment to serving marginalized communities. In her role at AARP Foundation, she oversees programs addressing the social determinants of poverty and among older adults and promoting equitable economic outcomes. With degrees in psychology and human and organizational learning, Emily brings a strong academic foundation to her efforts to address complex social issues. So it's so great to have you here today, Emily, and I'll turn the time over to you.
Great. Thank you so much, Linda. And it's just wonderful to be with you. As you said, in our Zoom world here, I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C., so all the way across country, but I couldn't be more delighted to be with you and really appreciate the fact that you're taking on this really, really important topic. We at AARP Foundation, we have been addressing both social isolation and loneliness and actually consumer fraud and abuse and exploitation of elders for many years. And so I love the fact that you're bringing those two conversations together. It couldn't be more important now than perhaps ever. So looking forward to being with you. As Linda said, I'm going to go through some slides and some information that I think will be helpful, whether you're coming at this, looking at it from you as an individual, as a caregiver, or supporting older adults in your communities. So hopefully we'll have a good conversation. And like Linda said, please don't hesitate to put some questions in the chat, and we will try to get to as many of those as possible. So I'm going to test my technical capabilities here and share my screen. Let's see if I can do that here. And then share, and I will pop that up and oops, whoa, hold on. Sorry, let's see. There we go. Let me try that again. Oops, hold on. Stop sharing. Let me try this again. Hold on. Just 1 second. See, it happens to the best of us, doesn't it? There we go now. Share my screen, share, and then we will, where's my slideshow? Hold on. Slideshow, there we go. And from beginning. Now, Linda, or someone, can you give me a thumbs up that you can see?
Looks great.
Great, awesome, thank you. Well, we overcame that hurdle, so that's step one, isn't it? So anyway, yeah, delighted to be with you. And as Linda said, I'm with AARP Foundation, and we have a mission that is really around creating and advancing the most effective solutions to help reduce poverty for and with older adults. And at AARP Foundation, we are really diligently working to end senior poverty. And our approach is really rooted in two key areas that we find, and I think this conference is bringing to bear, two key areas of economic opportunity and social connectedness, because those two things really do go hand in hand. We are, many of you are probably familiar with AARP. Some of you may not be as familiar with AARP Foundation. But we are AARP's charitable affiliate, and we serve both AARP members and non-members. And we run direct service programs. We have an amazing and vigorous legal advocacy team. And we also spark bold and innovative solutions that help really build resilience, strengthen communities, and really restore hope for older adults, particularly those that are most vulnerable. We have an amazing vision around a country free of poverty where no older person feels vulnerable. So just a little bit, I wanted to ground us in the AARP Foundation and share a little bit about what we do. But isolation and loneliness, it is really a growing topic. It really, I'm thrilled that the U.S. Surgeon General really sees it as a public health crisis. And so it seems like in this ever more connected world, look at us, I'm coming to you from Washington, D.C. So we are connected in so many different ways. But the fact of the matter is that there are so many experiencing this issue. And it is really having a dramatic effect on individuals, families, and communities. And I think it's really important. I appreciate being able to start the conference by really grounding us in these issues. Now, some of you may be very, very familiar with social isolation and loneliness. Others may not be. And so I hope to share some information that will really ground us on the impact of social isolation, the complex, risk factors and things like that, that really go into contributing to isolation and loneliness. So I want to, this is an interesting stat, and this actually is a stat that has held even pre-pandemic. If there's one silver lining of the pandemic that we all went through, is that we have that shared experience of pretty much everybody I know experienced some level of social isolation or loneliness during that time when we had to physically distance. Families couldn't see each other, your normal routine was interrupted. And so, if there's one, so like I said, silver lining in this, it's the fact that we, prior to the pandemic, people would say, oh, isolation, or there's kind of a stigma attached to loneliness. But that really created a shared experience that allowed people to realize, wow, this is an issue that can impact me and those that I love and those that I care about. So when I think about, this 1 in 5 older adults, close your eyes for a second and think of 5 older adults in your life. One of those people is experiencing the effects of social isolation and loneliness. So I think it's really important to, show that more attention needs to be placed on this growing, really epidemic, if you will. So I want to kind of start by defining some terms, because we tend to use isolation and loneliness in the same sentence, right? Or interchangeably. And so although they are very closely related, isolation and loneliness are not the same thing exactly. And it's really important, I think, as you think about how are you going to address it, or how do you support someone who may be experiencing this, it's really important to understand, is it a case of isolation or is it a case of loneliness? Because the intervention or the solution that you develop or suggest may be very different depending on that. So social isolation is objective with very measurable factors like the size of your network, the frequency of contact with that network, the quality of that contact, the availability of things like transportation and access, as Linda started, access to resources and information. If you don't have those things, if you have a very small or no social network, if you don't interact with them very often, or the quality is not great, you don't have mobility options or the availability of transportation, that's something very quantifiable. Loneliness is really more personal. It's a feeling of being alone, of not having connections, companionship, and a really important sense of belonging that we want and very much need. It's a subjective experience, and as a result, it's not as easy to measure. I usually use the example, and you probably have experienced this too. You can be in a room full of people and still feel very lonely or like you don't belong in that group. And so that's really more related to loneliness. You have the network, you may attend a church group or volunteer somewhere, but if you don't feel connected to that group, or you don't feel that sense of belonging, then you could still feel very lonely. So I think it's just really important to point out some of the differences. And what's interesting is the problem of social isolation looms even larger for lower income older adults from underrepresented communities. So people of color, the LGBTQ community, immigrants, refugees, and those living in rural areas are often already marginalized in society. And they also face disparities in access to services and culturally appropriate care. So I think it's really important to think about, who is being impacted by this the most. And so in seeking solutions to social isolation and loneliness, we're also addressing social isolation. We can often address loneliness as well, but it's important to understand the difference. Now, as many of you may have heard this and seen some of these stats, but isolation is really a health issue. And I have to say, some of the research that we've done, the partners that we've developed, the fact that it is a health issue has allowed us to elevate this issue beyond just a personal issue. It actually becomes almost a societal issue. So studies have found that isolation and loneliness are worse for your health than obesity, High blood pressure, increased susceptibility to the flu and other infectious diseases, greater risk of heart disease, earlier onset of dementia. And what I love about this conference is higher risk of fraud and abuse. And so that's really, such an important component of making sure that people realize that isolation is in fact a health issue. And the stat, it was so amazing. Social isolation is as bad for you as smoking 15 cigarettes a day. And we all can ground ourselves in that because we know how bad smoking is for you, but it is very much connected to that same level of impact on the health. We know, in fact, that subjective feelings of loneliness can increase even the risk of death by as much as 45%. Can you imagine that? We at AARP Foundation know that so much of the health and well-being of individuals is affected by external factors, also known as the social determinants of health, like access to nutritious and affordable food options, availability of a safe place to live, quality education, clean air and water, and adequate transportation. We can't truly improve an individual's health without improving the community's health as well. This slide provides additional data to support the prevalence of loneliness amongst older adults. Studies show that subjective feelings of loneliness can increase the risk of death by as much as 45% and have a 59% greater risk of functional decline. So again, it's really linking it, it's really making the case, the business case, if you will, or the healthcare case, that in fact, if we must address social isolation and loneliness because it is having a profound effect on people's health and well-being. As part of also making the case that this needs to be a focus, and often we work with, whether it's healthcare providers or health insurers or partners, community partners, part of what we want to do is make sure that we're making the case that in fact more resources, more financial resources need to go to addressing social isolation. A recent AARP Public Policy Institute study found that a lack of social contact is associated with increased Medicare spending to the tune of $6.7 billion. I mean, imagine that. You can see here on this slide, each month Medicare spent an estimated $134 more for socially isolated older adults. It's right up there, really, with what you kind of traditionally think about healthcare spending going to: high blood pressure, arthritis, diabetes, heart disease. It's right up there in the same. It's actually above high blood pressure. So it's just, again, it's kind of linking the fact that we're beginning to see research that shows that how these social determinants of health, and that there are in fact financial implications. And as I said, although a complex set of circumstances and factors contribute to isolation and loneliness, including the lack of affordable, accessible transportation, reduced mobility, and other challenges, there's a direct connection between lower income and higher isolation risk. It's not a one-for-one, but we did a study with the University of Chicago that really looked at our older adults living with low income experiencing higher rates of social isolation. And in fact, there is a connection between the two. So it's always good to ground us in the fact that some of our most vulnerable older adults in our communities don't have access to the resources that they need to address their levels of social isolation and loneliness. We actually released a survey, Loneliness and Social Connection, a national survey of adults 45 and older, which found that nearly half of adults over 45 with annual incomes of less than 25,000 were reported being lonely. So I mean, that's just an incredible figure. And so it really calls upon us to figure out what are some of the solutions and making sure that no one's being left behind as we think about those solutions. We think about technology and access to technology, which is really important. But if you can't afford it, if you can't afford to be online, if you can't afford to have the hardware and the software that you need, then that presents a barrier to people remaining connected. We know, we know today more than 37 million older adults are struggling to make ends meet. Of those, more than 10 million are already living in poverty. This means a significant number of vulnerable older adults could be at risk for isolation and loneliness. Access to comprehensive quality healthcare is important for promoting and maintaining health. And this includes not only primary care, but oral health care, obtaining necessary prescription drugs, behavioral health, and increasing access to these services and supporting coordinated care practices help improve health outcomes. Now, it's not all up to the healthcare system. We actually did a consensus study with the National Academies of Medicine to really look at what are some of the solutions that help that would, how is social isolation and loneliness impacting older adults, particularly those living with low income, and what are some of the solutions? And certainly healthcare plays a role in that, but they can't do it alone. It really does take all of us working together in almost what I term a collective impact approach. Now, healthcare, health primary care physicians and healthcare providers can certainly help screen for social isolation and loneliness, and we're seeing an uptick in them doing that actually, which is really encouraging. But we also have to strengthen the ties between the healthcare providers and the community-based organizations, like many of you, I'm sure, on the call, that have actually the programs and the services and the solutions that actually could help address. So we've got to strengthen those ties and connect the dots between the healthcare systems and really important community-based organizations. So I'll talk a little bit now, kind of switching gears here, of let's really talk about what are the risk factors. Everybody wants, kind of wants to get to what do I need to be looking for, right? And certainly increasing awareness of this crisis and identifying solutions is critical, but also critical is really understanding what is at the root of why someone may be experiencing isolation and loneliness. As I mentioned earlier, risk factors can be identified at the societal and community level and at the individual level. At the community level, as an example, as I said before, limited or unaffordable transportation, rural or unsafe or inaccessible neighborhoods. So, you think about it, someone may have lived in a community for a long time, and their situation changes. They used to be able to get out, but now they need to walk instead of drive. And how safe is the neighborhood, or how accessible? Are the sidewalks okay, and things like that. So really making sure that we're looking at, is in fact this neighborhood or this community age friendly, because that can be really important to make sure that people can stay connected. And then of course there's societal barriers, things like ageism and other forms of discrimination that really do play a role in when you think about it, it's like so often there's a myth around older adults and the use of technology, and whether or not they can use technology. That's a form of ageism that can reduce the access to important resources that would actually help individuals stay more connected. At the individual level, I'm sure these are no surprise. Some of the risk factors, certainly, as I said before, being low income can be a risk factor. Linda referenced this too earlier, being a caregiver. Often as a caregiver, you have to take a step out of the workforce, or you have to move to a new community. You become, obviously very involved in those that you're caring for, but that can also leave you with a sense of being really isolated and lonely. Chronic health conditions, hearing and vision loss, retirement. And, a lot of people are like, oh, I can't wait to retire. When you think about it, it's, you often work. I know for me, often work is such an amazing social network that I have. I love being with my colleagues at work. And if I think about taking a step out of the workforce, then what's replacing that network that I have? As I mentioned before, limited mobility. Maybe someone was able to drive before and they can't drive anymore, or have had a health crisis that limits their mobility. So all of a sudden their routine changes. Living alone is a risk factor. It doesn't mean that everybody living alone is isolated or lonely, but it is a risk factor. And certainly loss of memory or loss of a spouse or partner can really be a trigger element. And I go over these because I think it's really important as we think about solutions, because I know you all are probably the same as I am in that, we want to understand the problem, but we also want to understand what are the solutions. And so, I think it's really important to think about why somebody may be experiencing it. Is it at the societal or community level? Well, that's one pathway to a solution. Or is it one of these issues? If someone has experienced for the first time some hearing or vision loss, the solution or the intervention that we may suggest could be very different than if it's an issue of being a caregiver. So I think it's really important, as I say, to peel the onion away a bit and understand really what is at the root, so that we get to the best solutions possible. So now, as we kind of move over to solutioning a little bit, I want to share with you just a few resources that may be helpful to you. And get ready, because I'm going to do towards the end, I'm going to do a little exercise that we use as a way to kind of get people to think about, making that plan to stay socially connected. So at AARP Foundation, we've made a long-term commitment to end social isolation and build the social connections older adults need to thrive. So in 2016, we launched connecttoeffect.org, which features tools and resources to help users evaluate isolation risk, reach out to others who may be feeling lonely and disengaged, and find practical ways to reconnect to the community. And we believe that the first step in addressing social isolation is to assess how it might be impacting you or someone you love. So as you see here on connecttoeffect.org, and that's connect and number 2 with an A, as you can see at the top of the screen, is to take an assessment. So we have an assessment that allows you can either take it for yourself or someone that you care for or someone that you're supporting, and answer a few questions. And again, this is mostly around social isolation. So it really digs into some of those risk factors and some of the more objective measures around social isolation. So, how many, how close are people to you? What's the size of your network? How often do you interact with friends and family and the community? And then based on your responses, it gives you more curated information or more direct resources to help, and with suggestions to help connect the dots with the right solution for why you may be experiencing social isolation or loneliness. So we always like to start with that assessment. And then on Connect to Effect, there's a lot of resources, both for individuals, for caregivers, and then for community-based organizations like the area agencies on aging and others, so that they can bring resources. They don't have to reinvent the wheel, but they can bring resources that we've developed to their communities and to help those that they're supporting. So I would just like to point out a little bit, and I'll go into a little bit more detail about a couple resources here in a moment. But given that this conference is very much about building connections to protect older adults and preventing abuse and exploitation, we know that there is a direct connection between someone being socially isolated and their risk of being a victim of fraud. I'm really excited to share with this, and I'm not sure if you know about this resource at AARP, but we have something called the AARP Fraud Watch Network Helpline. And you see here, there's the number that you can call. AARP Fraud Watch Network offers a free helpline. And last year alone, this is such an amazing, kind of staggering figure. Last year alone, we were just shy of 82,000 calls. We average over 400 calls a day. Now, we're not, a mandatory reporter. This is really just a space for people to call and feel supported, get some more information about frauds and scams, and then, help understand if they do feel like they've been a victim, then what are the steps that they can begin to take? And it's amazing. We have an amazing group of volunteers. It's a volunteer-based model. So those that are answering the helpline are trained volunteers. And it's just amazing what we hear from those calls. And during those calls, we hear quotes like, I couldn't sleep. I've been sick to my stomach. I couldn't sleep. I'm afraid. I'm worried. I'm lonely. being harmed, like the harm that comes from being a victim of scam, involves a moral response. And the feelings involved can be very, very painful. This one just really got to me. I'm aware now that this is a scam, but I'm so lonely. And the person messages me every day and checks in on me, and I'll pay them money to continue to do that. I mean, that just hits, you so hard to recognize that often the scammer, the con artist, whatever you want to call them, may be the first person that person has talked to or interacted with in days or weeks or maybe even months. And so that's really why we see that connection between social isolation and fraud and exploitation of older adults. It's just, many, and also many are very worried that if about losing their independence or appearing to have diminished mental capacity, so maybe reluctant to share what's happening. So that's why, we really see that peer-to-peer model of older adult volunteers really talking with the older adult that feels like they've been exploited or scammed. But we just learn so much about the fact and the motivations that, they know it's a scam, but that's the only person that they've talked to in a very long time. So it's so sad, but it's really helped us form not only how we address financial fraud and exploitation, but also how we really connect the dots with social isolation and loneliness. So again, that's why I'm so thrilled that you all are doing this conference. So I want to share a little bit with you now about, again, kind of going back to Connect to Effect, a little bit more about what's available on the website. One of the things that we have is what we call our community workshops. And these are resources that individuals or community-based organizations can use free of charge, that allow them to hold or host workshops that really dig into the issue of social isolation. What are the risk factors, just like we've been talking about this morning or this afternoon, and then getting people to really empowering people to take those steps. I find it really interesting, particularly working with AARP and AARP Foundation. We talk so often about the fact that you got to do financial planning. Starts early. Young people, you start thinking about that 401k and that financial plan to make sure that you're financially secure as you age, and particularly as you begin to think about retirement and things like that. You know what? We don't talk at all about making a social plan. And I really want to change that. Before people begin to experience isolation and loneliness in later life, let's back that up and say, okay, as important as making a financial plan, it's as important to make a social plan. How am I going to remain socially connected now that I know the risk factors and I may encounter one of those risk factors? How do I stay? What's my plan for staying socially connected? And so the community workshops could really help with that. It like I said, introduces the topic. It makes it accessible. It kind of demystifies the issue. It hopefully destigmatizes the idea about talking about being lonely or being worried about being socially disconnected. And so I really want to change the dialogue and put out there that it's as important to build a social plan as it is a financial plan. And so here's the little exercise that I was going to do. One of the exercises that we have is something called a friendventory. So a little bit about the friendventory. This is as adults, when you're in school and you're a kid, it's fairly easy to make friends, right? I mean, you're connected to your classmates and you have kids in the neighborhood. It's a lot harder as you get older to make true friends, right? And so this friendventory activity, and I encourage you, if you're at home or wherever you are, go ahead and kind of we'll walk through what the friendventory activity is. So it's really looking at, like you see on the screen, 3 concentric circles. And that middle circle is, I can ask this person for a favor. I always think of it as, it's 2 o'clock in the morning and some emergency happens. Who am I going to call? And for a lot of us, we could name quite a few people, right? You know, a friend, a best friend, a sibling, you know, whatever that relationship is. But people who are connected and people who have a plan to stay connected have a lot of people in that center circle, a lot of people that they can call at 2 o'clock in the morning and they can ask that person for help. Next ring out is, you know, we chat from time to time. I'm sure you all have too. You have neighbors, you wave. You know, you probably know their name. You know, you know a little bit about them, and you talk over the fence, right? As they say. And so, you know, write the names of people kind of in that category, in that orange or yellow ring, in that second ring out. And then the last ring out is, you know, acquaintances, I would say. You wave, maybe again, maybe it's a neighbor, maybe it's a family member you haven't talked to in a very long time, kind of a cousin, a distant cousin or something like that. You know them, but you're not interacting with them on a regular basis. The Friendventory helps people kind of begin to think about, how do I move people from that outer ring closer into that center ring? And so, you know, what do we need to do in order to do that? And so, you know, looking at things like, maybe, you know, I'm gonna reach out to that cousin I haven't talked to in 10 years. You know, I'm gonna send them an email, and just start to think about, all right, how do I move that person closer and closer to the center? It doesn't happen overnight. You know, it's certainly, and it's not easy. A lot of the community workshop and a lot of these types of examples or activities are really meant to build your own confidence to reach out to someone. You know, you know, it's interesting. I usually share this story that I had a neighbor, an older lady who lived across the street. I didn't know her name, and here I work on social isolation issues. I know that she lived alone, and I know that she worked in close proximity to her house because she would walk to work. And, you know, I think we probably waved again, didn't know her name. So she would have really been on that outside circle for me, and I would have been on the outside circle for her. And so one day she was coming out of her house, going to work, and it was pouring rain. I mean, it was literally pouring rain. And I was coming down my driveway in my car. She was walking with she did have an umbrella. And I thought to myself, you know, I should give her a ride. I should at least offer a ride. And you know what? I didn't. And there's something I have thought about it. It was years ago, and I have continued to think about that and reflect on, why didn't I? And sometimes there are so many social norms that, oh, you know, I don't know her. I don't want to intrude. I don't want to, you know, I don't want her to think that, you know, I don't think she can walk. Whatever the case might be, there was something that was preventing me from offering my neighbor a ride, you know? And so I think it's so important that we think about that throughout our lives. And again, like I said, that was an experience when I was deeply, and have continued to be deeply, immersed in the social isolation and loneliness area. But even for me, it was hard because I didn't want her to feel like I thought less of her. I thought she was lonely, or whatever the case may be. So I think it's just really important to start thinking about, how do we get over some of that stigma? How do we get over some of those social norms that say, no, take a step back, you know? And so this is just one activity that I think is helpful as you think about, like I said, making that really important, very important, maintaining that social plan and those social connections. Because the truth is, humans need connections. We are social creatures. We are social beings. And it's interesting, when we first started working on the social isolation issue, we began to look at really the basic needs that older adults living with low income have. And so that really pretty quickly formed what we termed our impact areas. And that was, you have to have good food on the table. You have to have a solid roof over your head. You've got to have a steady source of income. And not that we needed a fourth pillar, but we really kept coming back to the fact that as you age, you've got to maintain those social connections. And so that really began our journey in addressing social isolation and loneliness. And it was really taking us so many different places, and really exciting research and work and solution building that we've done directly with individuals, with community partners, and nationally. So I'm going to wrap up and see if there's some good questions that have happened. I want to just leave you with a couple of our websites. I talked about connecttoeffect.org. You can certainly come on and learn more at aarpfoundation.org as well. And I'm just really excited to see what questions there might be. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, I hope. And stop share. There we go.
All right. Thank you so much. That was wonderful, Emily. And I had so much food for thought and things that came to my mind and questions that we had. Just a reminder to everyone, if you have questions for Emily, if you can type those in the Q&A down at the bottom of your screen, you just hover over it and click on it and type your question in. We do have one question for you. We have a widows and widowers group in our area that helps connect individuals and connects to community organizations. Has AARP considered reinstating the Widow Person Service Program they used to offer years ago or something similar? You'll have to tell us all what that is. I'm not familiar with it.
Well, I'm going to share, I will share that I've been with the AARP enterprise for 29 years. So I pretty much know most of the programs that have happened. Yes, so we did have widowed person services, and we also had another program called grief and loss. So it was really addressing the impact of losing someone very close to you, whether it's a partner or a spouse. That's a really good question. I would love to see that reinstated, but doing so in a way that really promotes social connection. The entire enterprise, not just AARP Foundation, is really focused on addressing social isolation, both from a stay connected and make sure that you're part of your community, and from a meaning and like I said, a sense of belonging. But yeah, that's actually a really interesting idea and thought. I don't know that it's on the docket, but I can certainly promote the idea, because I really was a fabulous program.
Interesting. I'd never heard of it before.
It's been a while since it's been. I think there's certain like AARP chapters and things like that that may still be doing a little bit of that and using some of the materials, but it's been a few years. But certainly, transition times, life transitions is a key topic for AARP, and making sure that we're equipping people with the right information and right resources. So always good to kind of look back in history and see what worked well.
Great. So we don't have any other questions in the Q&A. Please type those in. But I have a couple of questions. I was thinking, I've heard this term before, social convoy, having a social convoy of people that follow you throughout your life.
Mhm.
Is this something that you feel like younger people should be thinking about at a younger age? What are your thoughts on that?
No, that's a great question, Linda. Absolutely. And I think, like I said, I really want to promote the idea that just like we do with signing up for a 401k, we're thinking about how do we remain socially connected. And, the other issues that we often work on are kind of specific to older adults. Social isolation, it's across the age spectrum, right? You can feel very socially isolated and lonely as a teenager or a young adult taking a step into the workplace for the first time. And again, certainly we all experienced that through the pandemic. So absolutely, I think you want to begin to, I hadn't really heard that term before, but I think you want to begin to think about what is part of my plan? Who am I going to purposely stay connected with? And why? In some cases, if you're a young adult or a person entering the workplace for the first time, you want to begin to build a social network that not only helps you stay connected, but also helps you with your career and career growth and development. And so I think you can think of a lot of reasons to stay connected, or who should be in that network and why they're there, but that may change over time. We've certainly had experiences. I mean, we've all probably had mentors in our life. And those mentors go from really helping you with career development into just being part of your social network. So I love the idea of promoting it as early as possible.
Yeah. And so it's made me really think that it's multifaceted, the importance of having this connection, because it's good for your health, as you've shown in those statistics, but also as an older person ages, it becomes more difficult for them to maybe get to the doctor
Right.
Schedule appointments, get the proper nutrition that they need. And so having that support network with eyes on them, helping and
Exactly.
assisting them is so
Exactly.
important. So I have another question.
Okay.
Can you talk a little more about the 4 pillars you had mentioned? They reminded me of protective factors in youth research.
Oh, interesting. Yeah, I can. So when we first came up with, a vision of a country free of poverty where no older person feels vulnerable, and our mission of creating and advancing the most effective solutions that help older adults secure the essentials in life. We went back to Maslow's hierarchy of need, quite frankly, if people are familiar with that, where it's really what are the basic needs in life? And so, as I said, we really begin to look at, you've got to have food on the table that you want, need, and deserve in order to be healthy and thrive. So that really evolved into our work around hunger and addressing food insecurity in our nation, particularly, obviously, among older adults. You have to have, stable housing. And so that really became our housing security area, where we were looking at not only kind of affordable housing, but also what are the services available to individuals as part of, stable housing. And then we've got to have a steady source of income coming in the door. And so, we focus on individuals who are 50 and older. So we're really looking at, individuals who are still in the workforce. So that became our income security work. We're building on a long history of employment and training programs, making sure that older adults are equipped with the skills that they need to remain in the workforce as long as they choose to. And then, like I said, our not that we needed another area, but really kept coming back to a basic need for humans is continued social connections. And so that really became our focus on addressing social isolation and loneliness in our country, understanding, not only the impact of social isolation and loneliness, but the size of the problem. And so once we begin to really dig into it, and as I shared with you, the fact that 1 in 5, 1 in 4 older adults experience social isolation and loneliness, we knew we were really, there was an urgency to act. And so those are really what we termed our impact areas. So
Great. I have another question.
sure.
I serve as a senior companion to a man in his 80s. Although he lives with his stepdaughter, he frequently expresses his loneliness, specifically saying he misses association with other men. Is that a common thing you see?
It really is, and interestingly enough, I mean, I'm actually glad that he's articulating that, because one thing that we do find is that, there are gender differences in an individual's willingness to share their experience of feeling socially isolated or lonely. And in this case, it sounds like there's some loneliness happening. So one, I'm glad that he shared that, because men often won't necessarily share that. And, again, kind of the stigma attached of, I'm doing fine. And so, yeah, I can see that. And, there could be things, and I don't know if there's an opportunity to get him connected. There's, a lot of things cropped up during the pandemic around, like friendly caller programs and things like that. And so if there's something in his background, is he a veteran? Is he, did he go to a certain college or university where there may be an alumni network? If there's some way to get him connected to other men that he may already have an affinity with beyond just being the same gender, that may represent an option to get him connected and fulfill something that seems to be missing in his life.
Um, it's interesting because we started a Friendly Callers program
Oh,
in our
see?
area agency on aging during COVID as well. And we are seeing a lot of men participating in that, not as volunteers, but as recipients. And in some cases, we've been able to match former, veterans together
Exactly.
and have created good connections there as well. So wonderful. So I have another question for you. Do you promote the AmeriCorps senior programs?
We actually are very connected to AmeriCorps, predominantly through a program that we oversee called Experience Corps. So we engage AmeriCorps volunteers, and in the Experience Corps program is just a fabulous program that connects older adult, it's a particular model, older adult volunteers who become tutors and mentors for children in either school systems or after school programs from kindergarten through third grade. And the goal is really twofold. It's really to give meaning and purpose to older adult volunteers, but also to help children get on grade level reading by third grade, because we know the long-term impact of that pivotal point in a child's life when they go from learning to read to reading to learn. And if they can't read or don't have good reading skills past third grade, there's long-term impact of lower graduation rates, lower income, higher incarceration rates. So anyway, that we are connected to AmeriCorps through that program, but I highly encourage, we do see such correlation between volunteering, continuing to volunteer. And again, when you think, Linda, you brought it up around the social convoy, think about how you get connected to volunteer opportunities in your community, because that can bring such meaning and purpose. And Experience Corps is just one example of that. So yes, we do promote the AmeriCorps Senior Program.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Volunteering is often a good solution for feelings of isolation.
Right.
And, some people may be homebound or so forth, but can volunteer, for example, in a friendly callers program as well.
Absolutely.
So I had a comment here just wanting to address the social stigma about feeling isolated or lonely. A lot of people are embarrassed that they're isolated or lonely. How would you address that with someone?
Well, that's why I think we really pulled together the community workshops, and even the assessment. We get more people who we kind of believe come in and take the assessment for themselves. But the fact that we say, take it for somebody that you care about or that you love, or you're supporting, it's really about empowering somebody to take those steps and, and have an open dialogue. I mean, I am really, again, the shared experience of the pandemic, I hope, has destigmatized that some. We all experienced it in some way. Social isolation, because it's such a kind of more quantifiable thing, is probably a little easier for people to talk about. But when you start talking about loneliness, that's just so personal, isn't it? So one thing that we really try to do is kind of not focus on the individual who may be experiencing loneliness, but actually, and that's why we named it actually Connect to Affect, because it really is a two-way street. If someone is experiencing loneliness, if we can get them connected to somebody else, then it's a two-way street. They help each other, and so it can be a very empowering experience for an individual, that they don't necessarily have to think of themselves as lonely, but they could be helping somebody else, and it helps them as well. So it is difficult. I mean, it's like with anything in our society today, when you talk about loneliness or mental health issues and things like that. It's hard to talk about, but it's so important that we just continue to have that drumbeat of the dialogue and bring it back to the really negative impact on health and well-being.
Great. So here's another question for you. Have you seen older adults go to doctors' offices regularly just for socialization? Has this been studied at all?
It has been a little bit. I would say actually probably, if they're connected to a doctor's office, then that there's something there. But we do have some research that shows, and we did some programming around visits to the emergency rooms as kind of a social engagement effort, and really working with healthcare systems. Also calling 911, for not an emergency, but actually just to reach out to someone, have someone come by, check you out. There's a social engagement there. And so we do have some, at least anecdotal information around the fact that, whether it's emergency rooms or calling, EMTs or whatever, an ambulance, that it's less about the health issue and much more about the social connection. We've seen that with banking too. So much of banking is done online, but older adults use that banking visit, or that, the opportunity to go deposit checks or whatever the case may be, as a way to interact with the tellers. And they've been doing it for years. And that's why when maybe somebody experiences a mobility issue, that gets interrupted. They can't necessarily go to the bank every week, and see that favorite teller that they've always been to. And so, really thinking about making that social plan of, okay, what's going to replace that? If I can't get out and I can't do that on a regular basis, something that I love doing, what's the replacement for that? And let's plan for that before we get in crisis. It's just like with caregiving. Let's plan for the potential to be a caregiver before that caregiving crisis occurs. Let's plan to stay socially connected before that our lives are interrupted and we fall into social isolation and loneliness.
And to that point, it goes back to your comments about how people become so vulnerable to scams.
Exactly.
Because of their loneliness and isolation as
Yeah,
well.
that quote just gets me. I mean, and we've seen that so often. It's like, I know, I shouldn't be talking to him. I know, because our first thing in our Fraud Watch network is, if you get a call, hang up. If you get a call, hang up. That sounds so easy. I do it, you do it, I'm sure. But the person that hasn't talked to anybody, I have talked to my brother about this, and he knew it was a scam. It was one of the I don't know, Microsoft, virus thing scams. I said, Eric, I've told you before, he lives alone and, the whole thing. He's like, I know, but, he hadn't talked to anybody for a while. And so, that's just it. That shows that we are such social beings that we need that connection. And even though they know they should hang up, they stay on the line. And that's when the scammer knows that they've won in many ways. And they target, they know, they read obituaries, they find out who recently was widowed or is a widower, who recently lost a partner, who recently moved into, a senior living facility, whatever the case may be, they know. And so it's just so important to make sure we have that constant drumbeat of making sure you stay socially connected. And particularly with scams and fraud, have somebody that you can check it out with. Who's that trusted person? Who's in that center circle, that you can reach out to and say, I got this call from the IRS, is this accurate? And so even if you just have that person in your center circle, that's going to go a long way to helping you prevent falling victim.
Interesting. So I have a couple questions that kind of all overlap with each other. And so I'm going to try to formulate them into one question, and I'll see how I do at it. So loneliness might lead to depression. There are also people who maybe consider themselves loners or introverts as well. And so when you're thinking about creating social connection, what would you say to somebody who's really struggling with feeling connected or wanting to be connected?
Yeah, that's a really good question, or series of questions. I consider myself a huge introvert, and I like being alone, in some cases, but I like being alone because I can choose when I want to be reconnected with people. I do have a number of people in that center circle, so that's a luxury that we have. Those of us that are not experiencing social isolation or loneliness, it's okay to be alone, and it's okay to enjoy being alone. So acknowledge that in yourself. But again, kind of going back to, all right, when you don't want to be alone anymore, or when you're feeling the need to be socially connected, how do you maintain some bonds so that you're not starting from scratch each time? So, is it going to a social group, or is it going to church, or, visit, joining a club or something like that? But recognize that it's also okay to be alone, and enjoy being alone.
Wow. So do you suggest finding friends who are younger than you so we're not all getting old together?
Oh, wow. I think intergenerational, multi-generational is always the way to go. I think, there's so much value that can be exchanged between the generations, so much learning. There's a lot of programs, or not a lot, but there's programs that really cropped up addressing social isolation and loneliness, that are really about storytelling and pairing younger generations with older generations so that they can share. Each generation has a value to provide. And so less about, so we're not getting older together, everybody's getting older together, but just so that you can find meaning and purpose in sharing your story and learning from others. I think that's, lifelong learning and sharing your story, is really kind of at the root of having some of those intergenerational interactions. That said, there is value to having a variety of ages in your life, because if you maintain the same network of people, and we've seen it happen, as people age, people begin to pass away, or need to change their living situation. And so again, kind of making that plan to say, all right, these are my two closest friends. If something happens with either one of them, if one of them has to move in with a family member or unfortunately would pass away, what do I have to replace that? So again, it's really just thinking ahead of who do I need in my life? I love that back to that social convoy. Who do I need in my life to make sure that I remain connected if my circumstances change and if my network changes?
And I think also recognizing that different people may play different roles in your life.
Exactly.
You may hear somebody say, I don't need friends, I have my family. And that friends might play a different social role or meet different needs for you as well. So having that diversity in ages and types of people that are in
Exactly.
your group as well. Great. Well, I think we've gotten through most of the questions, or at least parts of the questions as well. We thank you so much, Emily. There's so much food for thought. And I really just going back to want to emphasize that idea of prioritizing connection,
Yes,
creating that plan to make sure that you have the connections that you need, and not being ashamed to reach out for help in
most definitely.
doing that as well.
Absolutely. Well,
So
thank you
great.
so much for letting me join, and thank you for doing this conference. It's just such an important topic.
Awesome.